Rounding decimals. In this video, we're going to go through a few examples on rounding decimal numbers. So we already learned how to round decimal numbers to the nearest whole number, and now let's look at some examples where we have to round decimals to the nearest tenth, hundredth, and thousandth place. So in our first example, we want to round the following decimal numbers to the nearest tenth. So I'm just going to underline tenth so we know where we're rounding to. And let's look at this first one. So we have 14 and 698 thousandths. So I want to round this to the nearest tenth. So I'm just going to write this decimal number out over here. So 14.698. I want to round to the nearest tenth. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to move one decimal place over to the right and look at what's happening in the hundredths place value. The hundredths place value, as we can see here, is bigger than 5. So that means I'm going to be rounding my tenth place value up a number. If it was less than 5, then it would just stay as 14.6. But because this is bigger than 9, we're going to be rounding it up. And when we round it, our final answer will be 14.7. Now we've rounded to the nearest tenth place value. That wasn't too bad, was it? All right, let's look at the next example. We have 3 and 9 hundredths. So let's write it out again. So 3.09. I want to be rounding to the nearest tenth, which is my underlined value. I'm going to look one decimal place over to the right at my hundredths place value, and I notice once again it's bigger than 5, so I will be rounding my tenth place value up. So for this one, my final answer will be 3.1, and notice how it's only one decimal place after the whole number, and that's because we wanted to round to the nearest tenths. Let's do a couple more examples. All right, example number 2. Round the following decimal numbers to the nearest hundredths. So in this example, we want to round to 2 decimal places because we know the second decimal place is the hundredths value. So let's look at the first example. We have 1,350 and 986 thousandths. So I want to round to the nearest hundredths, so I'm just going to rewrite that number again. 1350.986. So I'm going to underline the hundredths place, which is the second number after the decimal, as we know it goes the decimal, tenths, hundredths, and thousandths. And because we're rounding to the nearest hundredth, we're going to look at the decimal place to the right of that hundredths place value, which is the thousandths place value. And I notice that it's greater than 5, which means my place value will be changing for the hundredths. So this number rounded to the nearest hundredth will be 1,350.99. All right, let's look at another example. We've got 1 and 903 thousandths. So once again, I'm going to write it out, 1.903. Let's underline our hundredths place value, which is the 0. I'm going to move to the right one and look at what's going on in the thousandths place value. Well, the 3 tells us that it's less than 5, so we're not going to be rounding up in this case. Because it's less than 5, it actually stays the same. So we don't round up, we don't round down. When it's less than 5, we keep it as is and just don't include that thousandths place value. So when we're rounding to the nearest hundredth, we want 2 decimal places. When we're rounding to the nearest tenth, we want 1 decimal place. Actually, let's take this a step further. Let's take 1.90 and say I wanted to round this to the nearest tenth. I'm going to underline the tenth, And I'm going to go over and look at the hundredths place, and I know it's less than 0 or less than 5, which means I am not going to be rounding up. It's just going to stay the same. So if I was rounding this number to the nearest tenth, it'd be 1.9. And look at that. When we round to the nearest tenth, we're only rounding to 1 decimal place. We're rounding to the nearest hundredth, we're rounding to 2 decimal places. Okay, now that we can round to the nearest tenth and hundredths, on to thousandths. In our final example, we're going to be rounding these following decimal numbers to the nearest thousandth. So let's look at our first example. It's 14 and 5,078 10,000ths. Ooh, that's becoming a tongue twister now. So we're going to start off by writing the number. I'm going to identify my thousandths place value, which I once again know after the decimal place comes a tenth, hundredth, and then we've got the thousands. From there, I'm going to move over to the right and look at what's going on in that place value. So this is a 10,000ths place value, and I see that it's a number greater than 5, which means the number in my thousandths value will be rounded up 1. So for this one, we're going to round it to 14.508. Not too bad. Let's look at our next number. So once again, write it out. 3.0721. I'm going to identify my thousandths place value, which is the 2 in this case. I'm going to move over and look at the 10,000ths place value, and I notice that it's less than 5, which means I'm not rounding up, I'm not rounding down. My thousandths place value remains the same. So this number rounded to the nearest thousandth is 3.072. Now let's, for fun, because we like to have fun in math, and math is fun, let's round the number we just got, 3.072, to the nearest hundredth. So to round to the nearest hundredth, I'd identify my hundredths place value. I'd move over and look at the number on the right, and I notice that it's less than 5, so if I were rounding this to the nearest hundredth, the number would just stay the same in the hundredths place value, to 3.07. Now once again, let's see what it would be if we rounded it to the nearest tenth. So I'm going to identify my 10th place value, which is the 0. I'm going to move over and see what's going on in the hundredths place value. We notice that it is greater than 5. So if I had to round this number to the nearest tenth, I'm going to be rounding that 0 up to a 1, which will give me a final answer of 3.1. So I just showed you how to round to the nearest thousandth, which is right here. So I'm just going to write thousandths. I taught you how to round to the nearest hundredths, and then to the nearest tenths. And what did we notice every time we were going down? We had a decimal place, the number was getting smaller and smaller in decimal place values. So we went from 3.072 to 3.07 to 3.1 when we rounded to the nearest tenth. All right, it's now time for you to try the practice problems. Good luck!